To acknowledge that the land on which myself and John are meeting is the land of the Larrakia people, so pay my respects to the Larrakia people past and present and future, and those all around Australia as well, because I believe we've got quite a few people joining us from interstate, which is excellent. I should have said my name is Kat Street, and I am one of the co-conveners of NTAES along with Christabel Darcy, so she's here as well today in the room. So quite a few of you, there she is, she just popped her head in. Some of you might know about the fact that AES is trying to do a lot of work in terms of getting a lot of our events happening online. So as I said, this is the first one that the NT will be delivering today, so we're very excited about that. And just to keep an ear out or an eye open for events that will be coming up on the AES website and through the alerts, because I believe that they'll be all accessible to everyone around the country, which is awesome. And I also just wanted to say briefly that before I introduce John, we'll keep questions till the end. That's in terms of talking about questions. If any questions do come up for you, feel free to put them into the chat box and I will moderate that at the end, and there should be plenty of time to have a bit of a discussion after John's presentation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce John Gunther, who is the research leader at Batchelor Institute. John has extensive experience doing research and evaluation across many different areas, including education, justice, child protection, mental health, and what I really admire about John's approach is that he has a really good way of thinking outside the box, and he's always very focused on the practical outcomes of any policies and programs that he's looking into, but he also finds a way to underpin his work with some really strong theory, which we'll hear about today. So without further ado, I will hand it over to John.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks everyone for coming along. You might need to mute yourself there, I think.
Myself.
Yeah, just to sort of keep the noise limited. Yeah, thanks for everyone for coming along and sharing in this presentation. And it's great to see people from all around Australia sort of joining in with us. And I could imagine that it wouldn't be too hard to invite people from outside of Australia as well, if there was a topic that was of interest to people elsewhere. The topic that I've got today is based on a paper that was published in the journal, the Evaluation Journal of Australasia earlier this month. I want to thank the journal for their willingness to take this paper on. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity of sharing some of my thoughts about this, and hopefully you'll have some questions at the end. So thanks, Kat. If you can move it on to the next slide. I too want to acknowledge that we're meeting, well, I'm meeting on Larrakia country, and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. And also acknowledge that I have benefited tremendously from my being on Larrakia country, but also being on other people's countries and sharing with them in the evaluation and research work that I've done over the years. So it's been a real privilege. I also would like to acknowledge my fellow authors, the co-authors of this paper that I'm presenting on today. If we move to the next slide, Kat, you'll see that the authors' names listed here in particular. So Tessa Benveniste, Michelle Redmond-McLaren, David Mander, Janya McCalman, Marnie O'Brien, Sam Osborne and Richard Stewart. And there were also a number of other people who I won't name that have been involved in this thinking with theory process from the beginning that were invaluable in providing insights that enabled us to write this paper. So if you want to download the paper and read the thing in full, there's the details there. Thanks, Kat. So just a bit of an outline of where we're heading today. I will first of all just introduce some of the tricky issues around boarding schools, you know, what the issues actually are, and share some thoughts about how we grapple with the outcomes of research on boarding schools. And then I want to then focus in on the main part of this presentation, which is about thinking with theory as a methodology, and how that played out in the development of the paper. Then a little bit about what we found out of that process, and then finishing up with some implications for policy evaluation more generally, what we can do with this particular process. Thanks, Kat. So what is the problem with boarding? For many people, I guess particularly if you, like me, went to school in an urban community where there was a school already there, you wouldn't even think much about boarding, but you would probably think, well, boarding is there as a great opportunity for kids to get an education, especially when there aren't educational opportunities in their rural or remote communities. And I want to acknowledge that boarding schools have played a really significant part in rural and remote education across Australia for a number of years. Particularly for remote Aboriginal people in their communities, in many cases, unfortunately, boarding is the only option that they have to have an education beyond primary education. So this is just to acknowledge that while there might be problems with boarding, boarding schools have played a significant role for a number of people across Australia and internationally as well. But that issue that for many remote First Nations communities, boarding is the only option, I think is a problematic issue. And in many cases, boarding is seen to be the solution to the problem of remote education. And partly that's a reflection of a view that sees remote education as a failure or an insurmountable problem. And we've all seen the annual Closing the Gap reports, which highlight the failure of education among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities more generally across Australia. But when you see the little graphs, remote always shows up as being the most problematic. And so when about 10 years ago, governments started to invest heavily in boarding schools as a solution to one of the perceived problems of remote education, that was probably the well-meaning intent behind the investment, was to provide people with better opportunities, more opportunities to engage in a quality education that they wouldn't be getting in their remote communities. So we've seen millions of dollars invested from the federal government in particular, and to some extent with state governments and territory governments, to support kids to leave their communities and go into boarding schools. And it's not just about the boarding schools themselves. There are residential facilities that have been built with this money. There are scholarship programs that are associated with it, as well as ab study and a number of other supports that are designed to encourage kids to leave their communities to get a good education outside of their community. So the strategy has been really successful. The numbers of young people that are leaving their communities and going to a boarding school has increased substantially over the years. In fact, a recent review, the Study Away review commissioned by the Australian government and some of the Australian government departments a few years ago, found that in the years leading up to that review, there was something like a 40% increase in the number of young people that were attending boarding schools. And boarding schools, at least, are in part responsible for the closing of that Year 12 achievement gap, which is another issue in itself. But nevertheless, just to say that that strategy has been really successful. But the problems with boarding schools don't necessarily show on the surface until you actually dig in with evaluation or research that actually unpacks what's going on. one of the issues with the policy initiatives and the investment has been that 10 years ago, there was very little evidence about what was going on in boarding, what the outcomes of boarding were. And it wasn't until about 2012 that the first of a number of papers became available that actually, on a peer-reviewed basis, showed what was happening in boarding. And if we just turn to the next slide, thanks, Kat. In the paper, we said that what is evident from the literature is that the outcomes of boarding for First Nations students are mixed. And a bit of detail there, there are indications that boarding can deliver improvements in economic participation, secondary school completion, transition into higher education, and a range of other individual and community benefits. And this is what's really important. These perceived benefits provide a sense of hope to families, to communities as a whole, that their young people, their children will benefit from boarding. But what we've seen in the literature, and a lot of literature, is showing that there are risks and costs associated with participation in boarding schools. And those included a disconnection from their family and kinship groups, a disconnect from cultural ceremonies and rites of passage. There are multiple mental health risks that have been identified in the literature, reduced familial connections, and the number of research papers and PhD theses that have come out as a result of an interest in this particular topic is extraordinary. A year or two ago, the number of papers, peer-reviewed papers and theses had reached something like 40, and it's probably about 50 odd papers that report on research and evaluation in this space now, up from almost zero at 2012. So that's a major achievement in the last 8 years. However, there is still a lack of evaluation of policy in this space. So a lot of research has been done on what happens to young people in the schools, but not a real lot of evaluation on policy. And that's one of the reasons that we looked at this issue and how we came about this paper in the first place, because of that lack of policy evaluation. Thanks, Kat. So I just want to outline a little bit about what we actually did. The screenshot that you'll see on the right-hand side of the slide there just shows, I guess, the process we use. It was a bit like Zoom. Back in the day, I think it was some Adobe platform that we used to do the same kind of thing. We had a whiteboard and we sort of tossed our ideas onto this screen in a platform, a bit like what we're doing now. But I want to talk a little bit about the theory behind this working with theory or thinking with theory process. And the main source of this theory comes from Jackson and Mazzei. And you'll find some good articles in journals by them, but also in the Handbook of Qualitative Research, the latest version by Denson and Lincoln, you'll see a whole chapter that's dedicated to thinking with theory. And the central premise is that it puts theory to work. They don't actually define it as a methodology in itself. They see it rather as a process. And importantly, they see it as both thinking work, that is epistemological, and being work or work about what's reality, that is ontological. So this is not just sort of some kind of academic exercise that we do with our minds. It's an exercise that we do with ourselves. And the really nice part about the process that we engaged in was that we were putting ourselves into this thinking work. And each of the people that participated in the process originally either had experience as researchers, as educators, as bureaucrats, as people who'd had some kind of participation in the boarding system. So we were putting ourselves into this process, and that's where the ontological comes from it, in this particular process. And what Jackson and Mazzei say is that what you do in this process is you integrate the data, the theory, any texts that exist, philosophical issues, and anything else, all of your experience, you throw that in. They describe this as plugging it in. It's a bit like putting it into a blender and seeing what comes out. And then they describe these processes as creating new assemblages. And these assemblages aren't things, they are processes that make and unmake the thing. In this case, we were looking for outcomes from boarding. And it's very much, and we discovered this as we went along, it's very much a process of arranging, organised, fitting together these different ideas, the different theories, the different experiences, texts and philosophies into something that creates a bit of a whole. Now, I must confess that at the time we started this, I didn't actually understand. In fact, the chapter in the handbook wasn't even published at that stage. So we were making this up as we went along. But it's as I read this chapter and another article by Jackson and Mazai that I realised, aha, this is exactly what we are doing. We went for a couple of workshops online like this, and then we started writing. And in the writing, there was another process of thinking with theory that we were engaging with. It was a really creative process that is very organic. It doesn't necessarily lead to a discrete answer, and it is incredibly messy. And I guess that's one of the weaknesses of the process, is that the messiness can actually get a bit confusing. And you'll see that sort of emerge in the next slide that Kat will put up. As we started to think about the question about what were the outcomes and how would we achieve good outcomes, say year 12 completion outcomes for remote students. We tried to use a bit of a realist frame of reference here to think about contexts, mechanisms and outcomes. And this diagram doesn't actually explain the half of it, because it just became so messy when we saw all of the potential pathways and the causal connections between one thing and another, and the multitude of different mechanisms that led into the intended outcome of year 12 completion. But we had to admit at the end of this process that the likely unintended outcomes were just as common as the intended outcomes, because there were so many different factors at play that would contribute to any kind of outcome. The problem that we identified in our experience was that often these mechanisms that are used will be discrete mechanisms. They will be working on their own, and that means that the messiness isn't necessarily seen by a scholarship provider or a boarding facility provider, or even by a policymaker, because all they're focused in on is their particular mechanism. Now, I'm not sure whether we can go to the next slide or not, Kat. There's a bit of a circle happening on the screen. Maybe just try it again. Now, whilst Kat's getting this up, one of the things that we wanted to sort of come to was a theory of change. And that was the theory, I suppose, that we thought we were starting to work with, but actually we ended up working with this thinking with theory process. But we did come up with a theory of change that we've now lost on the screen. And I might just wait for Kat to bring it back up again. These things happen. Or would you like me to try bringing it up, Kat?
My computer's just frozen. I don't know what's happened. Yeah.
Well, I'll try to. You'll have to unshare.
Stop share.
Okay, great.
Sorry about that.
Just one moment again. I had the wrong screen. Apologies. Right, I think, I take it you can all see that, what's on the screen there now, like a bubble diagram with different things. Yep, cool, okay. So this is the diagram that we ended up with in terms of developing something that looked a little bit like a theory of change, where we recognised that the system that boarding sits within is actually a complex system. We used complexity theory in thinking about, well, how this might look. But moving away from that realist process and trying to put this into the frame of reference of a theory of change was really difficult. And what we ended up doing was trying to simplify this so that the bigger circle that you see there represents the system of boarding, or the system that boarding sits in, with the mechanisms with the described under headings of the small blue circles, so policy, boarding, institutional, individual, community, and funding. And the contexts of boarding sort of sitting somewhere on the side there, and the outcomes then described as either unintended or intended, or desirable or undesirable outcomes. And so what we saw is that as we thought with the theory, which include our experiences and the data that was already there, we could see that by initiating a policy that was designed to get people to complete Year 12, you might actually end up with a bunch of unintended outcomes beyond Year 12. And so the unintended outcomes might be that the student goes away to boarding, comes back, and finds themselves doing nothing. Maybe just hanging out with family, and that's an unintended outcome. And we observed in the data and our experiences those unintended outcomes. There are also a mix of desirable and undesirable outcomes that weren't what we expected to see as well. And so, for example, someone might go away to boarding, come back and finish prematurely, but because of the skills and confidence that they had gotten from that experience, they were able to step into a role, whether it be sort of a job or a leadership role, and were able to do stuff that they wouldn't have been able to do, but it wasn't the intended outcome. They didn't actually achieve Year 12 as the intended outcome. But there are also lots of other undesirable outcomes that we saw happening, which certainly weren't intended or even unintended, but they were undesirable. So people leaving the boarding school, coming home, finding that they were disconnected from family, finding that they'd missed out on a whole lot of cultural obligations and experiences that they would have been part of if they had stayed in the community. And so I guess that's where we came to. And we then tried to articulate that theory of change in fairly simplistic terms as being, first of all, if the players in the large circle tend to work together towards intended outcomes, the likelihood of achieving intended outcomes is increased with people's working together. So that involves a bit of collaboration on the part of everyone. Communities, providers, policymakers, funders, and so on, all have to work together. And it's not to say that they will get those outcomes, but they're more likely to get those outcomes. And that I guess, that thinking comes from complexity theory. The converse can apply too, is that if the players in the larger circle do not work together, the likelihood that you will get unintended and undesirable outcomes increases. And so if you see your role as being discrete and not interacting with other people in that system, then regardless of your intention to get good outcomes, the likelihood that you will get unintended or undesirable outcomes increases. And so that, I guess, in a nutshell, is the theory that we came up with. Now I can move this on myself, can't I? So, just turning to the benefits of this idea of thinking with theory, it, I think, allows for an open examination and a problematization of complex issues. And boarding is just one of many complex issues that evaluators are faced with. And it gets away from the need to find a definitive single answer to a particular problem. And in particular, it helps us to avoid the what works trap. Often when we go into an evaluation, the commissioner wants to know what works. And sometimes they want to know what works for whom, under what circumstances, and what doesn't work. But this actually avoids both of those traps, because what it's actually doing is looking at a system more holistically in such a way that you not only find out what works and what doesn't work, but you find out how things work and don't work. And indeed, you uncover issues that you weren't expecting to uncover, because you're open to a number of possible outcomes. The other nice thing about this particular process is that it doesn't depend on data. And so you don't have to go around madly collecting a whole lot of data, because you use existing data. And that data actually can be the people that are working in this way, their experiences, their observations, and it can also be things that are already written up. It can be things that might come from theory and philosophy themselves, and they are what we plug in to the mix. And it's not. The other thing is that it doesn't depend on sort of a thinking process alone, because it's both epistemological and ontological. You are allowed to bring yourself into this process and your own being. So in the process that we developed, we had people that were involved in transition support services who brought their own perspectives, their own selves into that process. And that was really helpful. And we were able to acknowledge that. So the third thing is that it's a creative way of developing solutions to problems. You don't start with a hypothesis, you don't start with a research question, you start with a willingness to create something from the ground up. And that, I think, is a really helpful way to work on policy problems. The other nice thing about it is that it doesn't depend solely on evaluators or researchers to do all the heavy lifting. The heavy lifting is done by everyone that's involved in the process, whether they be academics, whether they be practitioners, whether they be policymakers, or anyone else that doesn't necessarily fit into one of those boxes. So all of those things make for a really interesting and rich process. But of course, the real challenge with it is the messiness. You don't end up with an answer, and you don't end up with a single solution necessarily. And that actually can be a bit of a problem if you were trying to work this way with a commissioner who was looking for an answer. But in my experience, I've started to use this process or methodology in other areas of my work. And I haven't really actually defined it necessarily as a methodology because it is just a process. And it's a way of working with people that treats them as being valuable contributors to a process that doesn't necessarily have a simple solution at the end of it. And you could imagine that any of the complex areas in Indigenous affairs, for example, could utilize this method because the problems, when we've tried to tackle them from this, I guess, more, we could even describe it as a rigorous process of academic inquiry, whether it be through research or evaluation, have not really come to terms with what the solutions are. and whether it's about employment pathways or remote education more generally, understanding attendance issues at schools, whether it be about in developing employment programs or improving community safety or addressing incarceration rates, all of these things remain problematic, and they have remained problematic regardless of the research that's been done to try to solve the problems. And that's why I think this process offers some hope, I guess, for both evaluators and for practitioners and for policymakers to deal with this messiness and come up with practical, I guess, innovative, creative ways of addressing the problems. And that's where I want to leave it for now, half an hour. That's what I said I would I'd do. So we've got some, we might have one or two questions. I can see one question already there. Kat, I'll let you just take over for the moment, and we'll go there with the questions.
Yep. So the question that Anne has written in the chat box is, John, what tools did you use to record the range of data that you collected? For example, things like NVivo.
Yes, we did use NVivo. So we had from the initial Zoom kind of meetings, we had a whole lot of data, so that we transcribed. We did put that into an NVivo project, and then we also brought together whatever literature we had and brought that into the mix as well. So it was that combination, and you can do amazing things with NVivo. I love it because it is so flexible, and use it for all sorts of analysis purposes. So the short answer is we did use a number of tools beyond the video conferencing tool, and including NVivo to do that.
Yep. Thank you. And Christabel, did you want to put forward your question? Oh, I'll unmute. Unmute. There we go.
Thanks, John. So I was wondering a little bit about if you could elaborate a little bit further. You gave some examples then on when this approach could be really useful. Could you also talk about perhaps are there circumstances when it's not appropriate, or are there circumstances where you perhaps wouldn't use this on by itself, where you would substitute it with other methods? Just really interested in how we integrate this sort of approach with more standard approaches.
Well, coming from a background of mixed methods research and evaluation, I'm familiar with a number of different methodological approaches and tools that can be used to do research and evaluation properly and ethically. I guess one of the things that we were confronted with earlier on is the question about, is this a space that we should be working in, because of the ethical concerns we had, and even 3 years ago there was this emerging body of evidence that was showing that boarding was problematic for a number of reasons, and that weren't necessarily being acknowledged by policymakers and providers. And so the ethical question for us, and probably for all of us who are involved in evaluation at some stage, is it right for me to be in this space when I know that the policy is wrong and is potentially doing harm? And that's a dilemma that we've got to come to grips with. And in particular, where we are tasked to do something by a commissioner, and we uncover things that will show the commissioner in a bad light, what do we do with that? How do we honestly and I guess with integrity, but also maintaining the relationships that we've built with these people, do this kind of work? And this, I guess, is where bringing those people into the picture is really valuable, or could be valuable. So you might have, for example, a commissioner who is a proponent of boarding schools or scholarship programs or whatever it is. And by bringing them into the process, right at the beginning, it gives you an opportunity to, I guess, problematize the issues that perhaps they hadn't thought about, and come to solutions that you wouldn't normally come to if you were just simply answering an evaluation question about what works, for example. I don't know whether that answers your question or not, but it won't work for everything. I mean, there will be simple systems, for example, that it won't work particularly well for, because you don't need to use this kind of messy approach. There are some things that are really better off dealt with by a simple research question, and then unpacking what's going on and working out, does it work or doesn't it work? And we've done that with I guess, research and evaluation on programs that governments run. And a paper that I wrote with my colleague Sam Osborne earlier on this year on direct instruction is a good example of that, where you don't necessarily want to know the messiness of this, you just want to know whether or not the funding is actually doing what it's intending to do. So I wouldn't use that process for that particular, or this process for that particular kind of work. This is for complex systems.
Got it. Thank you.
We have another question in the chat box from Sharon Davis. So I think she's referring to the slide, John, if you go back on your presentation, the one with the blue circles, I think. So can this approach be used to create one of the missing blue circles, e.g. building a system boarding policy?
Yes, I think so. I think, you know, this is not necessarily a definitive model or theory of change. It doesn't actually answer everything. In fact, it's very scant in its detail. And what it assumes is that there's a whole lot of embedded processes that sit behind those blue circles that aren't unpacked at all in this. So we tried to unpack them in our discussions, but that's when it became really messy. In terms of that question about, for example, building a system boarding policy, that's a good question. And actually even understanding what the policy really is a bit of a difficult issue, because I don't think you'll find a stated policy on boarding from federal government or even state and territory governments. You'll see elements of it. So for example, with the territory government, they've got a policy around transition support, but it doesn't actually translate into a policy on boarding. And in the federal arena, it's really difficult to find any definitive document that actually spells out what the system policy is. What we see is examples from the public record in Hansard that sort of give you clues, and also clues from funding allocations that show where priorities are in policy. But it is, I guess, there is a case to be made for having a system-wide boarding policy that doesn't currently exist.
Thanks, John. And then we have another question from Anne Bosio, who says, is it incorporated in real-time evaluation as part of longer-term developmental evaluation? And she says that integrating this in the planning is where evaluators can be useful. Yeah,
I'd agree with that. This particular process wasn't a developmental evaluation. It started out really just as an idea, and we thought we could have a bit of fun getting together and actually exploring some of the issues. So that it really started off quite organically and loosely. It certainly wasn't intentionally developmental, but I have started to apply this in evaluations where the processes are intentionally developmental. And so I'm working with a school in West Arnhem Land at the moment, doing an evaluation of their school. And that is intentionally developmental. And we are using these kind of processes to talk with community members, to talk with other stakeholders in their particular smaller system to understand how it's working. So yes, I think it could be incorporated, and it could be quite useful for evaluators and participants, evaluands.
And then Marty has asked a question, which is what I was also wondering, is how long did the process take, and is it unaffordable for some? So what sort of resourcing needs to be considered?
Yeah, good question. In fact, it took it took us about 6 months to get the ball rolling from the time of, coming up with the idea, having a couple of workshops that were spread out over about 3 months, and then starting to write it up in the first instance. And then it took another 2 years to actually get it to a point where it was ready for publication. So this has been 3 years in the making. It hasn't been funded one bean. We haven't received any money for this. So, and I guess that's what makes it a bit unaffordable in the sense, but it hasn't cost us anything apart from our own time. So we have, the only thing that we need in terms of resources was the mechanism like what we have now, to be able to bring together our ideas. And so we used like a whiteboard that's available through Zoom to jot down our ideas and put screens up and share files and stuff like that. And most of those things are publicly available, or at least available through organisations quite easily now. So I don't think it needs to be unaffordable. It doesn't need to take an awful long time, but in our case, it did take a while.
Great. We've got a few more questions to get through. The next one is from Michael Barton, who says, if you could go back and change anything in the process, would there be anything? And what would be your advice for others considering heading in this path?
Yeah. Well, if I'd known about this thinking with theory in the first place, I wouldn't have started scratching around with ideas like, we initially conceived this as a bit of a community of practice and used that to frame our thinking. And that was good, but it didn't really answer sort of the question about what we were really doing. It was, we were a community of practice, but it didn't really answer our question. So I would have liked to have known about this before I actually started in the process. And a bit like, what happens when you start writing something up and you get review back from people who are reviewing a paper, and they suggest, why didn't you have a look at such and such? And this is the kind of thing that actually happened organically in that process. We actually came across this because it was suggested that we have a look at this particular thinking with theory approach, and we applied that then not only to what we did in the early stages, but into the writing up as well.
Great, thanks, John. Next question is, could or would you go back and apply another method which did weigh the pros and cons and provide recommendations about whether the policy works in a certain context if you were asked to by the Commissioner? And would there be enough data to do this?
I think there's no question that there is enough data. When we started 3 years ago, that there was probably a question mark about that. The data is well and truly in now on onboarding and all of the different mechanisms that feed into that system. And we've had 2 or 3 inquiries, federal inquiries, that have really fed into informing our understanding. So if we were asked by a commissioner to weight the pros and cons, I'm not sure whether it would give a definitive answer on that, but what it would do was give you a range of options that a commissioner could then choose from, and I guess cost for themselves, and see what the practical options or the practicalities of those suggestions might be. So, it wouldn't give you a numerical answer and say, well, the best way forward is to put all your eggs in this one basket, or to do that. But what it would do was create a bunch of options that perhaps you hadn't thought of before.
Okay. Next question is from Liz Forrest, who says, how do you think about the weighting of the different sources that you plugged in?
The short answer is we didn't, except to say that, there were some limitations associated with this. One, for example, is that even though all of us had something to do with remote communities, none of us actually came from a remote community. So we all were working with people in communities or had experience working with communities, but our little community of practice didn't incorporate people from remote communities. And partly that's a limitation of the the system we were using, which depended on internet connections, and that's, I guess, another issue altogether. So, in a sense, we didn't give due credit to the context in this particular scenario. And in fact, as we were writing things up, there were a whole bunch of other elements in the mechanisms and context that we realised that we hadn't thought of, that came to light because of our additional interactions with people who are living in remote communities. So we didn't try to actually weight one thing more heavily than another. And in fact, I think we tried to be respectful of all of the different players, including the individual themselves in this. And so while we might think, for example, that funding is something that is such a big issue, but what about the individual and their motivation, their needs, their mental health that is central to outcomes? And how does funding, for example, feed into that person's well-being at the end of this process? So it's complex and messy. We didn't try to weight them, but we recognise, of course, that there are limitations with the process that we used. It is highly creative and it is organic and it is innovative, but it doesn't come up with a whole bunch of answers, like definitive answers, I should say. It comes up with options.
And then we've got one final question, which is, was there agreement from all the stakeholders involved that the long-term goal was Year 12 completion?
We came to the conclusion that Year 12 completion was a primary concern for many stakeholders because of the emphasis that funders placed on this as an outcome. So, scholarship programs were almost entirely focused on getting kids to Year 12 and getting them to completion. The fact that transition support services in Northern Territory and Queensland were really focused on providing an alternative to community-based education so that young people could complete Year 12 was a consideration. The fact that the Closing the Gap target from the federal government included Year 12 completion as a primary concern fed into our understanding that this was an intended outcome. Now, I do realise that there are other outcomes, and in our discussion on this, we did recognise that other outcomes such as employment, transition to further education or university, or community-based outcomes, so leadership within the community, capacity to be able to look after your family, your extended family, your immediate family were important issues as well. And cultural outcomes as well were a consideration for us. But the reason that we had Year 12 in there was because of the emphasis that was coming through from policy. And if we were thinking about this as a tool for policy, then that had to be in there.
Okay, so that's all the questions we've got. Thanks for that, John. Did you want to have a quick look at the list and see if there's anyone that you wanted to invite to comment?
Let me just see. I see lots of familiar faces, which is great. We've got one or two authors that are on the paper. I don't know whether Sam, Sam Osborne, have you got any comments that you want to make on this? You are as one of the authors.
Oops.
No, I think that's covered it very well, John. And I think as you've addressed in the paper and the presentation, there is a lack of policy, a lack of theory and policy to sort of just start having the good conversations. Sometimes it's going to be a hard conversation, but it's one that needs to be had if the space is going to grow and improve. And I think this is a really great initiative, and well done.
Thanks, Sam. Have I missed out on anyone else? Just wave your hand or show your face if you were a contributor to the paper. or you've got a particular question that's burning. I'm happy to take questions offline too, by the way. If you've got a question you don't want to sort of pose publicly here, then by all means do so. And I'm aware of the range of stakeholders that are present here, who probably have would have a critique on this that would probably be quite critical of this process. And that's okay. I'm more than happy to take that those questions and critiques and comments offline if people want to do that. My contact details, by the way, just so that people can do that, are there.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, John. I just wanted to apologise to everyone for those technical issues that we had. They sometimes happen. My computer just froze for some unknown reason. And also apologies to those that I admitted a few minutes late. Kind of had a steady stream of people coming in for the first half hour or so. So I'm sorry to those who missed the first few minutes of the presentation. So finally, thank you so much to John for taking the time out of his busy schedule to share his thoughts with us in this area. There was quite a lot of chat and questions that came through actually. So I'm sure a lot of us found that of value. So thank you, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and keep an eye out for more events that will be getting going in the online space by AES. So I hope everyone has a great day, and bye-bye.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.